One of the main areas that ecologists study is populations. And a population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. One of the things that population ecologists look at is a population's density, which is how many individuals there are per unit of area. So they might look at something like the number of bacteria per milliliter, or the number of cows per acre, something like that. And then kind of related to that, they may also look at a population's dispersion, which is how they're arranged within their ecosystem. And so we see a few fairly common patterns of dispersion. The first is here with the starfish with a clumped pattern where they're all grouped together, clustered together. The advantage of that can be protection, protection in numbers, and being able to work together. So this is also the type of dispersion pattern that we see with humans because we live in cities. Then we have the penguins here, and they're showing a more uniform pattern of dispersion. The advantage of a uniform pattern is more equal or fair sharing of resources because you're evenly spaced in the environment. And then the last one here is the random pattern, and that's going to be primarily found in more opportunistic type species, so things like weeds. Demography is the study of the vital statistics of a population and how it changes over time. And one of the things that demographers study is survivorship. And they have created these survivorship curves to look at how long, like at what point in life species tend to die. And they can plot that as a curve for that given species. So basically there's three main types of curves that we look at, and they're just numbered. So type 1 here is a situation where the organism lives until late in the lifespan and then start to die off. So humans would be an example of that. We tend to live until the end of our lifespan and then people die of old age. Type 2 is a weird one because it's kind of basically they can die regardless of age. There's no connection to age versus when they die. So they can die at any point in their lifespan. And so we have a little squirrel here that is an example of a type 2 survivorship curve. And then our third example here with this mussel is kind of the opposite of type 1. Most members of that species will die at an early point in the lifespan of the species, and very few will survive until the later time of their lifespan. One of the main areas of study for demographers is changes of population size, and they look at what factors might cause a population to change in size. And there's really four main things that would affect it. So you've got two that would cause an increase in the size of the population, the obvious one being births, but also immigration, organisms moving into the population. And then they also look at two factors that would decrease the population. And again, the obvious one is death, and e-migration is the other, organisms moving out of a population. And so you can calculate then the population growth by looking at those four things and how they are affecting that particular population. And if the births plus immigration equals the deaths plus e-migration, then you have a stable population, an unchanging population. So the equation, though, is often simplified to just being R equals births minus deaths, where R is the rate of increase. So by kind of taking out the migration factor, it makes it simpler to study. So if R is greater than 0, then the population is increasing. If R is less than 0, then the population is decreasing. And then if it's equal to 0, you have that stable population, what's known as zero population growth. There are two main types of growth, population growth, that demographers describe. And the first is what's called exponential growth. And this basically says that under ideal conditions, plenty of resources, ample food, space, shelter, etc., a population can reproduce at its reproductive potential, meaning it can have offspring as often as they are able. So, some bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes. So a population of bacteria under ideal conditions would double every 20 minutes. So this is called exponential growth because it grows exponentially. And so when you graph it, you get this J-shaped curve that we see in the graph here. And so what you tend to see when graphing a population that is showing exponential growth, you see a very slow rate of increase initially because the population is small. And then it reaches a point where it will drastically increase. And realistically, there aren't many populations that would exhibit this type of growth. In fact, humans are one of the few populations that do have an exponential growth situation. The more realistic type of growth is called logistic growth, which shows that as population density increases, individuals have less access to resources, so population growth slows or stops. The population ends up leveling off around what's known as the carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals that an ecosystem can support. And so when you graph that, you get this S-shaped curve, where initially you have that exponential growth pattern in the early stages because there's plenty of resources when the population is small, but as the resources become less available and there's more competition, that's when you see it start to level off there at that carrying capacity. So what we have to realize, though, is that it's not like they just stop. They don't stop reproducing because there's not enough resources. Most organisms can't think that logically. And so what will happen is the population will actually fluctuate around that carrying capacity where it'll go slightly above, and then now resources are not as plentiful and organisms will begin to die off, and then it will dip below, and now there's plenty of resources again, so the population can increase, and so we go back up and then back down and back up, and so it actually fluctuates around that carrying capacity. And also that carrying capacity is not a set value. The carrying capacity itself can fluctuate based on circumstances in that ecosystem. If you're experiencing a drought, for example, you might see that carrying capacity decrease and that ecosystem can't support as many individuals. And then later, when conditions improve, the carrying capacity can increase because now there are more resources available. So it's not a set in stone value, but it can fluctuate depending on circumstances. Species have evolved different what's called life strategies that give them an advantage in different environmental situations. So there's two main types of strategies, K selection and R selection. So K-selected species tend to be those that have very few but what we call expensive offspring, meaning they require a lot of care and long-term parental guidance. So elephants, for example. And these populations, these species, are going to tend to be more successful in populations that are stable and near carrying capacity, which is what K stands for. So these guys are going to be more successful in those high population density situations where they're going to be able to compete for resources. Our selection, on the other hand, these guys are adapted for scenarios where for example, there's been a sudden opening of niches. They can fill those niches very quickly because they have very large amounts of offspring very quickly, but they also don't tend to care for them for terribly long, and survival rates are fairly low. So they're going to see the most success in those early stages where you've got a rapid rate of growth, which is why they use the letter R there. Remember, R is for rate of increase. So because they can reproduce very quickly, they tend to be very successful in those early stages, but not as successful when there's a greater population density because they simply aren't adapted for the competition. So remember that most populations are not going to exhibit that exponential growth. Most are going to have the more realistic version of logistic growth. So the things that are going to limit those populations and keep them from continuing to grow exponentially are known as limiting factors. And there's two main types of limiting factors. We have density dependent limiting factors and density independent. Some populations are controlled by one versus the other, and then others will be controlled by a combination of both. So density dependent factors, these are going to have a much greater impact the more densely populated an area is, the more organisms there are, the greater the impact. So this is going to be things like disease and competition and predation. Again, think about the more of them there are, the greater the impact. The more of them there are, the more competition there will be. So that would be a density dependent factor. And so we would basically, you would see that as density rises in that situation, the death rate will either increase or the birth rate will decrease, or a combination of both. Density independent, on the other hand, it doesn't matter how many there are in the ecosystem, the impact will be the same. So these are typically going to be catastrophic events, things like a hurricane or a tornado or something like that, clear cutting of a forest, things that are going to wipe out a large number of population indiscriminately. And so you won't see that kind of connection between the death rate and birth rate. So sometimes, as I said, it can be a combination of both. For example, there's a dune fescue grass that its death rate is controlled by a density independent factor, which is the shifting dune sands exposing the roots. It doesn't matter at all how much grass there is. When the sand shifts, the roots are exposed and the plant dies. So that's density independent, whereas its birth rate is density dependent control, because as resources become less available, the birth rate will fall. And so you can see in this graph, these graphs here, it can be controlled by one or the other, or a combination of both. Now, some populations won't show a nice, pretty S-shaped curve, but will instead show a pretty constant fluctuation in their population size. And we see this in particular with predator-prey relationships, especially if they're very closely tied. If a particular predator depends solely on one type of prey, then those populations will be kind of connected to each other, and they will fluctuate in response to each other. So you can see that in the graph here. The snowshoe hare is the blue line, and the lynx is the red line. The lynx is the predator, and the snowshoe hare is the prey. But you can see that as one rises, the other rises, and as one falls, the other falls. So the way I like to kind of show this is, if you think about it, if the prey population is high, how's that going to affect the predator population? Well, it's going to cause the predator population to rise because there's plenty of food available. Well, when the predator population rises, that's going to cause the prey population to decrease because they're going to be eating them all. And when the prey population decreases, that's going to cause the predator population to decrease because now there's not enough food available. When that predator population decreases, the prey population can go back up because they're not being eaten as much. And so you get this kind of cycle that causes this fluctuation, this constant fluctuation up and down of both the predator population and the prey population.